Hi everyone, I'm Yael. I go to school at Macaulay Honors College at CCNY. And my project title is Hey Siri, Can the Internet Help Prevent Suicide? So just to begin, I want to give a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing. I'm first going to go into my position on this topic and my inspiration for looking at this area. And then I'm going to go into the statistics about suicide being the 10th leading cause of death in America. Then I'm going to discuss my target audience, which is young adults and suicide trends that are prevalent among them. Then we're going to go into the suicide's role in this conversation, in the internet's role in this conversation, excuse me. Then we're kind of going to pull it all together and look at young adult suicide and the internet. Then we're going to end off with the laws, the solutions that have been proposed, and advances in suicide prevention. So to get started, we're going to look at my position and my inspiration. Unfortunately, we're not going to watch the TED Talk, but I do suggest everyone should watch it. It's a TED Talk by Lori Pritchard. It's called What I Learned from My Husband's Suicide. Interestingly, what inspired me from this video wasn't really her main idea. It was actually just a one-liner that she said when she mentioned that her husband's unexpected suicide the day after. She was looking through his search history and she found that he had been extensively researching the link between depression and suicide. And when she said that, it really made me think, what if she would have known? What if she would have been notified that someone that she loved was really struggling, and it would have maybe perhaps been prevented? So this led me to my thesis statement. My research is an attempt to understand the intersection between suicide and the internet, and to prove that the internet itself may be a powerful, effective, and innovative way of combating the suicide epidemic plaguing our youth. So I think it's important to just discuss how suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in America. In the year 2019 alone, 12 million adults had serious thoughts of suicide, 3.5 million adult males made suicide plans, 1.4 million adults attempted suicide. These are obviously very large numbers, which contribute to it being the 10th leading cause of death in America. I think it's important whenever discussing a gap in prevention to discuss what's already out there, and to recognize their efforts. So obviously we have the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, we have the Trevor Project, which is specifically for LGBTQ crisis. And then we also have the Crisis Text Line, which has revolutionized crisis intervention by creating a platform specifically for texting. So this is like kind of our starting point. This is what we're looking at as a huge problem in our country. So I explained already, I kind of clued into the fact that I want to be talking specifically about young adults, and there's a reason that I want to do this. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young adults. This is obviously very clear from this chart, which is the same year, 2019, of past year prevalence of suicide attempts among US adults. And you can look, I circled it in red, from 18 to 25, they were much more likely to have a suicide attempt. So this is why I'm specifically discussing this age group, because even though it's affecting virtually everyone in this country, it's disproportionately affecting this age group. So now I'm going to talk about the internet's role and why I'm even trying to create an intersection between these two spheres. Because as I was thinking, obviously the inspiration from Lori Pritchard's TED Talk, but also just in general, as I was thinking about the fact that suicide has been on the rise in this country, I also thought about what else has been on the rise in this country. And that's obviously the role of the internet. We know metaverse, we know Google, basically everything we do has some sort of connection to the internet. And I found this one fact that really even ties it even more closely to my topic. 80% of internet users in the United States have searched for a health-related topic, including mental health. This would have included Lori Pritchard's husband, who is extensively researching the link between depression and suicide thoughts. So it's not that internet users are just using it to socialize. They're also legitimately looking into why they're feeling the way that they're feeling. And it's difficult for people around them to get them the help they need if their thoughts and concerns about their well-being is being confined to search engines and social media platforms. It's very difficult for loved ones to get them the help that they need. So just to look at specifically young adult suicide and the internet, we have to really look at how much young adults are using the internet. So 88% of US young adults ages 19 to 29 use the internet. 95% of US adults had a cell phone. 77% of US adults had a smartphone. 26.7 is how much of a day 13 to 17-year-olds will spend on their phone on average, which I think is 6.5 hours. So it's not just that, sometimes people will search the health-related topics once a day. Young adults are spending a good chunk of their day on the internet. They're all connected somehow to this metaverse, Googleverse, whatever you want to call it. We're all doing so much of our interactions on it. So it makes sense that people who also want to prevent a different trend that's occurring might look at the intersection of these two occurring increases. So when discussing using the internet to try to come up with an innovative way to prevent suicide, we have to talk about the pros of the internet and also the cons, because anytime you're proposing any sort of new way to combat something that's affecting so many people, there's obviously going to be good things why this should be passed and also some negatives of using the internet at all. So obviously the pros, the destigmatization of mental health issues. As mental health issues are spoken about more, they're obviously destigmatized. I mean, I think everyone can agree. We've seen many celebrities come out to discuss their mental health issues, many influencers discussing resources, and this is helpful. This gives a lot of people access to resources that they wouldn't have known about. This leads me to my next point: more resources available. Even though there are great resources, without the internet, it would be virtually impossible for people really to have access to them in today's age, unless they were looking up in a phone book, which isn't really as used anymore. If someone wanted to contact the crisis text line, they're very likely to just Google crisis text line and then immediately be given access to their number. And then, of course, if you all agree with me at the end of this presentation, hopefully the internet would be very positive if it could be used in order to prevent suicide. Then there are the cons to using the internet at all. There's a lot of harmful content found online. There's an article published in the New York Times speaking specifically about one website that actually, instead of helping people who are struggling with suicide, was encouraging suicide and also giving resources in order to help people kill themselves. So this was obviously, it's very scary and concerning for someone who wants to prevent suicide to read and to think about that when you're talking about the internet as maybe a way to help people, there's obviously a lot of people out there who do not want to help, and there's a lot of harmful content found online about suicide and about other topics as well. And one could suggest, well, why are these websites allowed at all? Why doesn't Google censor? There are many legal issues in censoring, and we're going to get to that. Obviously, again, excessive screen time is not a good thing. It's linked to many different issues, such as bad sleeping habits and also decreased levels of mental health wellness. Obviously, also privacy issues. So when we're talking about the internet, people feel very safe to look up specific things that maybe they don't want other people to know. So why would it be our job to look into that? There are obviously rules of privacy. So I mentioned before that there's a lot of laws with censoring any type of content that's found on the internet. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So this is actually what protected many of these websites, because when parents fought back to websites that contain harmful content and they really were looking at Google to censor it, Google kind of had to hide behind Section 230 to say, well, it's really not on us to censor this type of content. And the website themselves also hid behind this in the sense of saying, if someone comments on a post suggesting something harmful, it's not up to us to censor it. So now we're going to talk about the solutions that have been proposed within this intersection. BARC is an application that is specifically geared to kids. So I know I was talking about young adults, which also included over 18. So I do recognize that this is mainly talking about younger, but I do think that this type of technology and this type of idea could be applied also to that age group if extended. But specifically for younger kids, which suicide also greatly affects, this application is geared to protect the privacy of children while also protecting their health and their well-being. So let's say, for example, a parent had the Bark application online and their child also had it. If their child, let's say, searched something about how to harm themselves, their parent would get a notification on their phone dictating just that text, not the whole conversation, just that text, and then given ways in order to approach the conversation with the child, and also next steps, maybe therapy or, talking points or anything else. Why this application really is revolutionizing mental health is because it's really protecting the child. It's not asking parents to look through their child's phone to look at bullying and all those things, because most parents aren't psychiatrists or mental health providers. So that would be very difficult for them to do. And also at the same time, it's protecting their health, because we understand that many people's harmful thoughts and feelings are being confined to social media. Problems with the solutions, I don't have time to get into all of them, but what we see is that most parents don't do this. Most parents are not using these type of parental controls or a type of things that are actually protecting the privacy. Most parents are actually likely to just look through history, which obviously is not protecting the privacy as we wish. So something like app maybe isn't used as much. Also, additionally, it's important to mention that Bark is also a paid app. You have to pay for it. A lot of people can't afford this. Another problem with the solution is the ethical debate. Many people would say that doing this at all would be unethical. I wish I could get into it, but I can't. And then there's also the advancements in suicide prevention. Verizon created a specific 3-digit code that, like 911, would directly put someone in contact with the National Suicide Hotline Prevention. Google also, if you search anything harmful regarding suicide online, you're directly going to be given into a box that will give you access to the National Suicide Hotline Prevention. So I think it's important to end with that, just to know that even though we do have a long way to go in suicide prevention, I do believe the internet could be a powerful tool in preventing this if we directly respond to the issues like something that Bark has, but going along the lines of what they've been doing. That is it. And these are my citations, and thank you. Thank you, Yael. And we have 3 minutes for questions if anyone has anything to add.
I'm sorry, for our moderator, your sound is pretty muffled. I couldn't understand what you're saying. Could you maybe type it into the chat? Nathaniel, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So I just wanted to ask if there was anything that she learned about this topic that kind of excited her, or something that she didn't really know, not really excited because I know this isn't a very exciting topic, but something that you didn't know before that you found really interesting.
I didn't know about the laws that protect most of these search engines, and regarding with censorship. I never knew about Law 230. I think I actually was always curious about how harmful websites could be posted. I really didn't understand the actual legal implications of not taking certain websites down that these search engines are facing. I think it's important to keep that in mind when a lot of these platforms are getting a lot of backlash, because they actually have laws that are protecting them. Thank you.
I have a question related to that. Oh, is there another student with a question? Go ahead, Janalyn.
Thank you. I was wondering, I know you said the Bark app is more geared towards younger ages, and you think it would be best for this also to be helpful for younger adults. Was there anything remotely similar to Bark that is already in development or like already existing, but maybe it's just not what you would prefer? Or is there like any other like app, like technological advancements in that sense for young adults?
Yeah, there are like other platforms like Go Guardian, and I get to go into it as much, but that's really where the ethical debate came up, because this platform is specifically geared towards, like, let's say I have a computer from school when I'm in high school. They have these type of technologies already instilled. So if they were looking something up, it would directly be given to a counselor or something, which obviously comes up with a lot of ethical issues. So there are other technologies. I think the problem really becomes privacy. Like if someone's older than 18, how can you like do this? It would have to be with the consent, I would assume. I think that's another like legal issue or legal area. My idea more so to expand it to older adults would really have to involve consent, which I think is a lot harder once they get older. But I still think it's possible. I don't think that it's like not possible to do it for older adults. I just think specifically right now, applications are looking more towards younger than 18 because they don't have a consent issue.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so just to keep track on time, we're gonna move on to Kyle Abrahams. He's gonna be speaking on titled Give Me a Sign, Culture, Ethics, and Accessibility in Deaf Mental Health Care.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, my name is Kyle Abrahams. I'm a psychology major from the Macaulay Honors College at the City College of New York. And as our moderator told you, I will be telling you all about culture, ethics, and accessibility in deaf mental health care. And so to start out, I should probably tell you why I became interested in this topic in the first place. So in the past few years, it seems that mental health has gone from a stigmatized topic to something that's very much in the mainstream. And so from famous celebrities and athletes, like here I have an example of Michael Phelps using their platform to talk about it, to even more everyday things. Like for example, I take the New York City subway every day to class, and I see ads just like the one you see on the right here, telling people that if they're feeling down, if there's a problem that they're dealing with mentally, they should reach out and seek help. And obviously, I think this is great on the whole. I'm someone who wants to expand mental health accessibility for all people. However, this really made me wonder, is this help actually available to all people? And when you start considering things like disabilities, and especially deafness in my case, I realized that services are actually not equitable. And so to give you something of a roadmap for this presentation, I'll tell you my thesis. So I argue that while the landscape of deaf mental health care in the United States has improved in recent decades, a wide gulf remains between access to adequate care and the needs of the average deaf American. Even if large-scale issues like a lack of linguistically and culturally competent professionals in the deaf mental health field cannot be solved in the short term, there are steps that can be taken. Expanding telehealth services and advocating for state-run mental health programs, for example, can improve accessibility and quality of care for deaf Americans and provide them with the services they need. And so for this project, in terms of methodology, I mainly did research. However, I also conducted a few interviews with some leading experts in the field to give me a better sense of the most pressing issues going on right now. And so before we get into the main part of this presentation, I should say some things about terminology. And so I'm going to go over these first 2 points kind of together. So when you see me write deaf with a capital D, so that refers to people who identify as culturally deaf. And what that means is essentially in the last few decades, the deaf pride movement has, in this country specifically, has allowed for a shift in the way we view deafness from the medical model of disability, viewing it as something that needs to be essentially cured and fixed, to the idea that deafness is just a difference and that people who are deaf can enjoy their own lives fully and they have a rich cultural experience. And that includes things like communicating the ASL, going to schools that are entirely deaf and living in deaf communities. And so if you see the lowercase d deaf, as you see the second example, that just refers to anyone suffering from hearing loss. And there's a lot of people who are deaf or hard of hearing in some way, but don't have access to deaf culture. And so they would fall under that category. And then that third one you see of the both lowercase and capital just refers to the community as a whole, anyone with hearing loss. And so related to deaf culture, also I should mention cochlear implants. And so these are a small device that goes behind the ear and it stimulates the cochlear nerve. And essentially what that does, it improves hearing. It does not fix it completely, but it improves hearing for people who have some hearing loss. And there's a political issue in the culturally deaf community because they believe this is kind of pathologizing their deafness and trying to fix it and forcing people to join the world of the hearing, when instead they would like to embrace their own culture. And so people who are culturally deaf will not wear cochlear implants for the most part. Then mainstreaming. So this refers to education and essentially sending deaf children instead of to a school for the deaf to what we would understand as just a kind of standard public school. And there's things like IEPs and pulling out of class programs that can help them, but overall they're not having the education that fits their needs best. However, still a very large percentage of deaf children are put into mainstream programs. And then finally, you'll see this at the bottom. So basically in this presentation, I'll say mental health practitioner and provider kind of interchangeably. That describes basically anyone working in the field. But if you hear me say specialist, I'm probably referring to someone more like a psychiatrist who has a higher level of education and provides very specific services. And I also think it's very important to discuss the diversity of the field and to get the point across that deaf Americans are not a monolith. As you can see, only about a third of deaf Americans identify with deaf culture, and 80% of deaf children are actually in mainstream education programs. So this means that there's a tremendous amount of diversity within it in terms of cultural and linguistic identity. And as you can see at the bottom, I also note that there's things like the BASL stands for Black ASL, which was developed as a result of Jim Crow segregation in our country, and regional dialects, like one example is Philadelphia ASL, means that a lot of people sign very differently from each other. So just because you learn ASL one way does not mean you can communicate with any given deaf person you might interact with. And so when we're treating people, it's incredibly important to acknowledge diverse backgrounds and know that people come from very different places. And so to get into the most substantive part of my project are the barriers to care. So every expert I talked to told me that the #1 issue facing the field is this first point here, the scarcity of linguistically and culturally competent mental health care workers. Oh, I'm sorry. There, so basically just from top to bottom, so we're saying psychiatrists to just staff at an inpatient ward, there are just simply not enough people who can sign and understand the cultural background of deaf Americans to properly treat them. And this is really not an issue that can be fixed easily because proficiency in a learned language takes between 5 to 7 years in an immersive environment. So it doesn't mean you can just talk to a deaf friend or take a class online. You have to be within deaf culture and truly signing all the time to really become proficient in the language. And this is also not something that can easily be fixed with interpreters. So basically for one, the threshold to become certified as an ASL interpreter is actually pretty low, and you have to have obviously be able to communicate in the language, but there's no considerations for cultural competency most of the time. And also it's important to consider that psychotherapy is already a very delicate environment in terms of privacy and just confidence that what you're saying will be kept between you and your therapist. So adding a third person can just add a lot of questions about confidentiality for people, and it may not be the best for feeling comfortable and really being able to open up in that environment. And so now I'm going to tell you about probably the most cutting edge issue in the field right now, which is language deprivation. Essentially what this term describes is people who grow up without access to a native language. And so basically this is for deaf people, this would be signing because speech does not come to them naturally as it does for hearing people. And it can cause a lot of cognitive and emotional issues throughout their life if it starts early. And it does sound somewhat uncommon, but as you can see from these statistics, actually is quite common when you consider that most deaf children come from a hearing family who likely are not part of deaf culture, and they go to a school where they don't have education, sign language, and they're just simply not signing in the home. So they're basically being forced to use English when that is just not their natural language. And so on the left, you can see a quote from Dr. Sanjay Gulati, who is a leader in this field. And he says, deaf children can be raised in loving homes, treated by medical specialists, fitted with high-tech electronic aids and provided special education, yet still emerge from childhood with a devastating, permanent, and preventable disability. So essentially it's saying that people who follow this medical model are using all these things to try to fix their child's disability, or what they consider to be a disability. However, they're not considering that the child is never having the native language that they should. And in terms of understanding why things like abstract concepts and narratives become difficult for these people, Dr. Gulati has a great explanation, and he uses the concept of love. So when you're born, you don't know what love means as a term. However, by seeing it used and seeing how people interact with each other when using that term, we build up this concept over our lifespan of what love is. And so essentially, if you don't have that that basis in language to learn what these concepts are, you can't really build up an understanding of the world around you. And so things like the passage of time, causation, and theory of mind, which is understanding that each person has their own unique feelings, experiences, emotions, that type of thing, is hard for these people because they just do not have the language background to build up what these things all mean. And that makes traditional talk therapy not very useful, because how can you understand and look back at your own life if you don't understand causation? And additionally, there's big issues with interpreting for these people beyond the ones I mentioned before. And so Dr. Neil Glickman, another expert whose work was influential in this, says, foreign language interpreters can genuinely assume that the people they are interpreting for are native speakers of their respective languages. Sign language interpreters cannot assume this. So I think this is so important because it essentially outlines that, say if you're talking to someone from a Spanish-speaking country, you can assume that they grew up speaking Spanish. If it's a deaf person who suffers from language deprivation, they grew up without any language at all, and thus do not have the same tools to understand the world that you and I do. And also, when we look at the DSM-5, Psychology's key handbook, there's also a lot of issues regarding deafness. And so for one, or it's important to say first, I should say, that psychiatrists, often in order to get paid by insurance companies and important things like that, they have to follow the criteria that the DSM lists. So the exact words in there are actually very important. And one issue is that often the DSM criteria pathologize deficits in speech, but not communication. So this means that, say, a 5-year-old came in who was a very proficient signer, but has never spoken because he grew up in a culturally deaf household, that child may be viewed as lacking in some type of cognitive way because they don't speak. However, their communication is exactly as it should be. Also, there's kind of a lack of consideration of the cultural differences that happen between deaf and hearing cultures in terms of verbal and nonverbal communication. Deaf Americans tend to use nonverbal communication much more. So essentially, these things can all lead to issues of misdiagnosis, and it can cause people to think that people, especially with language deprivation, for example, might have things like autism spectrum disorder or a learning disability, when really they're not considering what the person's history is and how they got to where they are in terms of their mental health experience. And so obviously it's important to identify the issues, but I think the best thing to do is we should start to look at solutions. And one example is state-run mental health programs for deaf people, and Minnesota's is one that I found exemplary. And so about 15 years ago, psychiatrist Dr. John Granaris took over, or became the first leader of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services program. And what he noticed right away was that almost all service providers for the deaf were based in either Minneapolis or St. Paul, the two biggest cities. And this can't work, because if people live in far flung areas of the state and have to drive hours to get to the only mental health practitioners, that's a huge issue. So by using the state funding that he had access to, he was able to set up 4 deaf mental health care outposts evenly distributed across the state. And And basically that means that people would not have to go as far to get the services they need. And basically this has been incredibly effective. And on a yearly basis, they serve 1,000 more clients compared to the prior sources, which were mostly inpatient programs for deaf people. There's other benefits as well. So one that we saw in Alabama's system, which is also great, is that it allows providers to circumvent restrictive catchment areas. So basically what a catchment area is it's the place where people have access to services based on the county that they live in usually. And so Alabama got by this by using their state-run authority to basically say that the entire state of Alabama was the catchment area for deaf residents, and so they could see any public service in the whole state. Additionally, basically, we can see that it's better suited to usher in this new, time's up, so sorry. Okay, well, really quick, also just say that telehealth is also a great way that we can combat this issue, and it had gained traction even before the pandemic, but it's a way that people can, if you don't have access to a nearby provider, you can still get the services you need by doing a video call instead of having to drive hours and have the stress of scheduling your whole day around your psychotherapy. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Kyle. we have, can you guys hear me a little better now? Okay, good. I think I just needed to change that outlet. So we have 3 minutes for questions if anyone wants to add anything.
So I have a question. Sorry, this is like, I don't really know much about the deaf community, so like, please excuse me, this is like a stupid question, but I know you like mentioned how like people who grow up deaf, they don't really have much exposure to language. So is it like typical for people who grow up deaf to learn how to read like language, whether it be English or the place they grow up in, or not really?
Yeah, so if you're, especially when, like I was saying, if you're raised in a culturally deaf type of environment, it becomes much easier to learn language. So for example, people who do suffer from language deprivation would likely have a much harder time with reading comprehension because they don't have that basis of language. However, if you sign from an early age and build up that understanding of the world with a native language, which obviously, as I said, is signing, yeah, it's these things like reading and things that hearing people tend to do pretty easily are all just about the same. It's when you don't have access to the language that these things become way more difficult.
I have a question too. I don't know, this might have been outside of the scope of your research, but are there good kind of evidence-based programs that exist for parents who are hearing parents who have a deaf child to help them gain some of these both language and cultural competency skills to maybe, I don't know, even like prevent some of these problems from emerging as their children grow?
So you're asking if there's programs to guide deaf parents, or hearing parents rather, who have deaf children? So yeah, that was not entirely within the scope of my project, but so I spoke with the head of the mental health program at Gallaudet University for the deaf in DC, and she told me a lot about how there are a lot of nonprofits who do things like put out, videos and other types of content for parents of deaf children to try to immerse them better.
All right, so we're gonna move on. We're gonna have Janalyn. So much. Thank you. Janalyn Robles. She's going to be presenting the implications of COVID-19 on teen mental health, a path towards unity. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Janalyn Robles, and I attend Queens College through Macaulay Honors College, and I'll be discussing today the implications of COVID-19 pandemic on teen mental health. Can you see the pictures, your images? Is it blocking your screen?
No, you're great.
Okay, thank you. So I'd just like to begin with why I chose this topic and why it was interesting to me. I think we can all agree the pandemic was and still is such a unique experience for us all. It was nothing we were prepared for or had experienced before. And I think as a college student myself, I can speak to the struggles of online learning and what I went through. But I always felt that I was at least lucky enough to have gone through high school to experience what kind of learner I was and became. So I was able to understand in what ways did I learn best and study best, and what type of learner am I? I learned that I'm more of a visual learner, and that things like repetition help me to remember things. And I felt that high school students, although they went through, middle school, I felt that high school was that start for me. And I feel like high school students during the pandemic didn't have that luxury of high school classes to learn what type of learner they are. And I feel that high school is already such a difficult time for teens when it comes to accepting themselves, finding who they are, what type of people they mesh well with, and just going through puberty, things like that. I think the pandemic further exacerbated certain anxieties they have in their life. I also have a 15-year-old sister, and I saw firsthand how she struggled through the pandemic and how her mental health declined. So I think by studying this, we can begin to understand what teens were going through, and we can begin to find ways to help them. Before I go into the state of mental health after the pandemic, I think it's important to address where teens were before the pandemic and where their mental health was. In 2019, the CDC actually reported the highest peak of teen depression rates in US history, and 18% of adolescents reported being affected by major depression at some point in their lifetime. And 17% of adolescents reported having an anxiety disorder diagnosis. And this anxiety diagnosis was the highest percentage has ever been in the past 10 years. So it was really alarming to see these rates and to see just how severe the mental health situation was for teens. Especially in the graph on the right, you can see from 2011 to 2016, the prevalence of a major depressive episode in teens in their lifetime prevalence was just on a steady incline. And from the statistics on the left, we can see from 2016 to 2019, these rates only continued to increase. So this really just sets the foundation of where teens were at mentally, and the pandemic further just caused their mental health to decline. So as we know, in March 2020, coronavirus was already in the US for about a month, and cases were beginning to spread and people were getting concerned. Online learning did begin around March 16th when the mayor shut down public schools, and around March 17th to 22nd, many stay-at-home orders were set in place, and New York City actually became the epicenter to the coronavirus pandemic. When it comes to these stay-at-home orders and remaining at home, that really forms a disruption of routine, and it really did not allow for people's sense of normalcy to continue. And when it comes to people who are already predisposed to mental illness, sense of normalcy and routine can be very helpful for them when it comes to stability and just helping them feel safe. And when that routine is not possible, that can lead to major declines in mental health, which did happen for many teens. For my thesis, I do discuss three main subsections of what could have affected teen mental health and the different ways. So I would discuss online learning, lack of socialization, and toxic households and family conflict within the home. But for today's purposes and for today's presentation, I will be discussing more of the online learning aspect. So as schools did transition to online learning, many researchers used the phrase emergency remote education, just because the sense of the transition was very abrupt and chaotic in a sense. Many of the lesson plans that teachers prepared were more for in-person formats, so it was sort of difficult to transition everything they had planned to an online format. There was also much unfamiliarity among teachers and students when it came to their programs and platforms. So things like Google Classroom, Zoom, many students weren't aware of how to use these different dashboards and systems. So that led to work not being submitted on time, work getting lost in transition, teachers not being able to fully connect with their students, major detachments and impersonal connections. And it led to many students feeling like school was just optional and not required. It led to just major declines in mental health overall. The term Zoom fatigue also arose very popularly among teachers and students. And this really had to do with the excessive use of technology for long periods of time, and it just led to physical and mental exhaustion. Many students and parents also had concerns about grades, because students that were doing extremely well in normal times, their grades severely declined during the pandemic. And they were concerned about how colleges would see these grades and if these grades would be counted as the same. And teachers also indicated major drops in motivation in their students during these classes, whether it was lack of participation or not appearing at all for their Zoom classes. It was actually a study conducted by Stony Brook University in 2021 that reported that out of 384 students, 72% of them said that they experienced a form of mild to severe depression during their online learning experience. And 75% of them reported experiencing mild to severe anxiety as well during this time. So we can see online learning really did not help teens' mental state. It further just helped the decline. There were also many educational inequities that were exacerbated by the pandemic. Many students in high school are currently facing low-income households, public housing, temporary or shelters, or they're even facing homelessness, or they live in immigrant households, which can sometimes be multi-generational households housing many people. And these sorts of situations lead to certain inequities. So for example, hardware and connectivity inequities. Many families did not have laptops or tablets or even a proper Wi-Fi connection to provide their children with access to online learning. When the pandemic did begin, 300,000 families in New York reported needing a sort of access to technology. Along with these inequities is digital literacy skills. So when these families reported needing a form of a tablet or laptop, when they did receive them, some of them did not know how to work them. Some families who they didn't have these technology to begin with, when they received them, it was just like, how do I teach my child how to use this if I don't know how to use it myself? And for the older teens, they were just left to their own devices to try and figure it out by themselves. And also a very important inequity is the proper work environment. So when we think, at least for me, when I think of a proper, healthy work environment, I would think of, a quiet space for myself, a desk, an open workspace, a moderate to quiet noise volume. And not every student has this luxury, especially those living in shelters or facing homelessness. And actually 1 in 10 students in the public school system are in a temporary form of shelter. And as we all know, these shelters are not, 3, 4, 5 bedroom large apartments. They can be 1 to 2 room apartments, often housing many people. So students facing this environment, they're not going to be able to access their online learning environment the same as others, which will then further help their mental health decline. So what are some interventions and possible solutions that I think have been very effective and would continue to be very effective? The president did release a sort of roadmap called the Return to School Roadmap for the DOE to follow. It provides a certain set of guidelines and goals that they would like the DOE to reach with reopening schools. And a primary goal of the Return to School Roadmap is prioritizing students' emotional, social, and mental health. Because as I have seen, the government has also seen the decline in mental health, and they were hoping to address it with the reopening plans for schools. And a big goal when it comes to prioritizing their mental health is investing in school counselors and social workers to physically be in schools and address student needs, and as well as providing teachers with professional development training. Another important aspect of this training is they want to teach teachers how to be able to point out students' signs of mental health, whether it's just their behaviors or certain comments. They want to teach teachers, what can you do in that moment if you experience that in your student? What is the next steps and what should be done after to help them? There has also been a shift in what type of assessments teachers should be assigning their students. So prior to the pandemic, a form of assessment that was very normal for us all, I guess we can assume, are summative assessments. These assessments are in the form of midterms and finals. They're assessments that are more focused on, let's see what you have learned at the end of a chapter, really. Those assessments are more effective when you feel that the teaching methods are effective. So now that students had moved to an online learning aspect, they're more detached and weren't able to focus as much. So teachers, there's now a shift to the sort of assessments they're assigning. So they now are focusing on formative assessments. These assessments are more assignments to help the student form an understanding of what they're learning. Not so much of, let's see what you did learn. It's more of, let's see where you're currently at and let me provide you feedback. So this can be in the form of an exit ticket, submitting an outline for feedback before a paper is written, or even mini quizzes rather than a large overall summative assessment. I feel that these formative assessments should be implemented more in the curriculum because these help establish a sense of understanding of a topic before those midterms and finals come. Because those midterms and finals, they can weigh a lot on grades, and especially if students are aiming for high grades and want to get into colleges, it's important so that they understand these topics before moving on to a final or midterm. Lastly, I think a very important aspect of returning to schools are rebuilding the teacher-student relationship. As I mentioned, when it's online learning, there is a lack of a relationship between teachers and students. That connection is just very detached, and that is very helpful for many students when they want to learn, it's helpful to have a relationship with their teacher, so they can ask them for help and feel comfortable asking them for help and saying, hey, I really need help with this topic. And a very important way to rebuild this is a strategy that many teachers have been taught in the past called an EMR method. So the EMR method stands for...
Sorry to interrupt, but time is up, Janalyn. So if we could conclude,
okay.
just to keep it fair, Anastasia's at the end. So.
Oh, thank you. I didn't see the chat box. Yeah, so the establish, maintain, and restore method is really just a way of teaching teachers how to establish, maintain, and restore any relationships between your students to help a more effective educational environment. And I'd like to leave you with the idea of, is this enough? I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but there's many ways to address teen mental health, and this is just a start to help them have a more successful educational experience. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have a minute for some questions, if anyone has anything to add. I think there's one in the chat box for you.
I think that there's different ways of creating formative assessments for every subject. So like for writing, it could be like a writing outline. And then like things like math, it could be a quick like 5-10 question worksheet of problems that aren't really graded. They're more just like given feedback on, because that's the focus of formative assessments. Not really a grade that will count heavily, more of just feedback so the student can learn from that and then form a deeper understanding. So there can be different forms of formative assessments.
All right, so we're going to move on to Netanel. He's going to be discussing running from depression, physical activity, mental wellness, and community during COVID-19.
Can you guys see and hear me okay? Great. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Netanel. My topic is running from depression, physical activity, mental wellness, and community during COVID-19. So like I said before, my name is Netanel. I'm a psychology major at the City College of New York and in Macaulay Honors College. And before I begin, I just want to give a brief trigger warning that we are going to be discussing mental health. So this is my thesis, and this is just a very broken down version of it, a bite size, so you guys can kind of see the things that I was researching. But in short, some of the different topics that I was looking into was the direct relationship between fitness, mental health, and overall well-being. And I'm also going to be talking briefly about this shift that happened between physical activity being used to help build community virtually and physically. And finally, also just to talk about the role that media has in promoting physical activity in this new way. Okay, so briefly, the things that we are going to be talking about. Firstly, mental health. These are just a few questions that I kind of looked into that I want to touch upon today. But being that my topic is very vast and large, these are just a few questions. So how has the pandemic intensified mental health? Then we're going to look at physical activity. How is physical activity used as a coping mechanism? 3, we're going to look at community. How are people interacting physically and virtually within the fitness industry? Then 4, we're going to talk briefly about the perception of physical activity and how advertisements are promoting a new era of physical activity. So for my project and for methodology and how I kind of went about doing this, I did conduct a survey among college students in New York. This survey was shared via social media platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, and also sent around students from various professors. And And then additionally, there were a few students who filled out the survey who were interested in being interviewed. So I did also did conduct a few interviews and get some interesting insight onto what people's student experience has been during this time. So firstly, I would like to talk about mental health. And also, I just want to say that the presentation who just went before me, I feel like Janalyn's presentation was a really great introduction because she kind of touched upon a lot of these topics about mental health, especially during in a very similar age group to the one that I was looking at. So as you can see, and as she already discussed very well, was how mental health among college students did see a very large spike during this time. As you guys know, in general, college students and teenagers are generally at risk and normally experience more mental health symptoms than adults. And as you can see, a larger than average share of young adults reported symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder during the pandemic. So even though they have already been at risk and have a history of experiencing these things, during the pandemic, these have only intensified. And obviously that was a very big issue. And then additionally, there's another thing that a few things that I wanted to highlight. Those without a pre-existing mental health condition are at an increased risk because they are not accustomed to feeling isolated or alone as a result of social isolation. So this was one thing that I found when doing my research, which was kind of surprising to me because at face value, something that I was expecting was that people who already had a history of mental health symptoms, those were the people that I expected to see have the biggest spike and increase in symptoms during the pandemic, but it was actually the opposite. It was the people who didn't have a prior diagnosis who were kind of experiencing these things because they've never had experienced social isolation before in this way. And I just want to highlight this idea of social isolation because it is something that we're going to discuss later when we talk about physical activity. So then some survey results that I got, among 68.7% of individuals who reported no prior mental health diagnosis. So among this group, for 40% who experienced mental health symptoms before the pandemic, they experienced mental health symptoms that intensified once the pandemic started. So these are people who had kind of some symptoms that got worse. And then there was also 10% experienced some mental health symptoms who never had a prior diagnosis. Okay, now I want to talk about physical activity. So physical activity has long been linked to improving mental health symptoms and reducing risk for disease. So this is something that it's been researched very much and something that, everybody kind of already knows. But then physical activity can also help reduce social isolation by connecting others physically and virtually. And this is something that I do want to touch upon more about, that element of building community and connecting others physically and virtually. So some more survey results that I got, 38% of students increased the number of days that they engaged in physical activity, 45% decreased the number of days, and 12% claimed no change at all. So obviously these results are very stratified and they differ. And this is also, very possible just because everybody's situation when the pandemic started was very different. People who normally participated in physical activity at school, and since schools closed, they might not have had access to their gym. I know during my interviews, some people mentioned that their gym closed and therefore they weren't able to go to the gym anymore, or for a lot of people they lost their job and therefore they couldn't even afford a gym membership. And obviously there's elements of people who, due to the pandemic, they were staying isolated, or they had to keep their family members safe and were not able to be around other people. So there obviously was a lot of factors at play. Some people who were able to adjust, maybe participating to the virtual world of physical activity, but there were a lot of different factors at play. And as you can see, that is very evident in the results. So now I just want to talk about some of the interesting elements of student experience and some quotes that I got from the interviews that I had. So some said I began working out due to the heightened stress of the pandemic and also in order to get my body into better shape. Going on daily walks helped clear my head. I also used extra time to learn how to weightlift. I began doing yoga every day via YouTube videos since the pandemic, and it has saved my mental health. So we do see how, people had different reasons for pursuing physical activity as well. And all of these were very different for people. So now I do want to talk about the element of community building that happened with physical activity. So firstly, I want to talk about this in the physical sense. So obviously there's an element of, being around others. So one student mentioned how I miss my partners and the social aspect of going to the gym. So being in a physical space, there is that social aspect that a lot of people really enjoy, and that is something that normally helps them very much. And with gym closures and school closures, people are just being isolated, and that was something that they weren't really able to take advantage of. And then just two interesting things from studies that I found was that inactive individuals are more likely to be active if they're exercising with another person. And also after conducting a few of my interviews, this was also something that I heard from a lot of students, that they enjoyed going with friends to the gym, and that was something that helps keep them motivated. And additionally, another interesting thing that I learned was that the most effective methods for reducing the mental health burden was participating in team sports, cycling, aerobic, and gym activities. So we do see that there is an element of like competition and team sports that also helps keep people motivated. And the reason that I think that is from a lot of the studies that I read was that even though some people might go, in addition to the mental health benefits and physical well-being, that people might participate in physical activity, there is also that element of competition that people enjoy very much. And those are benefits that you can kind of get, I would say, pretty immediately while you're participating in these different things. So that is something that is a really important element that I wanted to highlight. And then obviously due to the pandemic, people, for health reasons and for closures, and people had to be separated, and there was this new rise in virtual physical activity that was on a rise. And I do want to highlight a bunch of these different options that people were able to take advantage of that has helped people in different ways. So there was social media, so Instagram, or like Strava, which is this new kind of social media platform that a lot of runners use, in which people are able to share their rides and their distance. So if I were, for example, to do a ride around Central Park, it would kind of track my distance, and people would be able to see my entire pathway that I ran. And then people are able to react and to kind of comment on that in that sense. And then there's also, sorry, it's not letting me go back. So just let me just stop sharing for a second. I'm sorry. Okay, you guys can see that, right? Okay, so the next thing I wanted to go into was there were also a lot of wearable technology options like Fitbit, Apple Watch, Whoop, and Garmin, in which people are able to interact with each other and kind of respond to people's workouts and challenge each other. So that was also very much on a rise. And then there's also gym equipment like Peloton, Hydro, that also allows people to interact by seeing people on a leaderboard and being able to see and compete with people even though they are very distant. And then I also want to highlight that there was an element of media in this sense also, and a lot of advertisements that Peloton made with Usain Bolt, and he highlighted that one of his reasons for participating in virtual physical activity was that he was able to, it was the people that motivated him who were right beside him. And if you think about it, in a very physical world, how many people are able to ride and or run next to Usain Bolt? Obviously, that's not really an option, but being in this virtual world, that was made possible. And then there was also a spike in virtual races, but due to time, I'm just going to skip this out part. And then finally, I just want to briefly touch upon the perception and promotion of physical activity. So as you can see here, before the pandemic and post-pandemic, the biggest rise that I just want to highlight here is that you can see that psychological condition before the pandemic was at 35%, and post-pandemic, it did rise to 60%. So there was a really big shift in that sense for students. So from appearance being at 62%, it did see a decrease. So pre-pandemic, the main two elements were physical condition and appearance. And then post-pandemic, it was physical condition and psychological condition. And then finally, I just want to end off with the influence of media and how these media sources kind of discuss this, even with a Petco, which is a pet company that spoke about performing physical activity for my mind, for my body, my mood, and my health. And that's it.
Thank you, Netanel. We do have about a minute and a half for some questions if anyone has anything to add.
I have a question for you, Nathaniel. How did your own exercise habits change or not as a result of the pandemic? And what's your favorite way to interact with the physical activity community?
I definitely think that it saw a spike just because personally I did have a lot more time on my hands. And just from a lot of my interviews, I found that was a lot of students had a similar experience. You know, if they were especially going to CUNY, a lot of people were commuters and didn't really find time in their schedule to do it, so to do physical activity. So this was a time where I definitely did see an increase, and it was great to see others had, you know, a similar experience.
All right, thank you. And just for time's sake, we're going to move on to Anastasiya. So last presenter is going to be Anastasiya Chabotska. She's going to be presenting artificial intelligence and psychotherapy during and after COVID-19. Take it away.
Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Anastasiya Chabotska. I attend Brooklyn College at Macaulay, and the title of my project is Artificial Intelligence in Psychotherapy During and After COVID-19. So in my project, I focus on how artificial intelligence can be applied and integrated in psychotherapy treatment of stress, anxiety, and depression disorders caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. I also address the question of why AI application is necessary and appropriate in mental health, what benefits it can bring, and what are its limitations. The reason I picked this topic comes from my computer science background, and as a computer science student, it's always interesting for me to see in what different fields and aspects of life programming knowledge can be utilized, and what kind of software we can build that will serve a bigger purpose other than fun and entertainment. Also, my work experience kind of pushed me to pursue this topic since the company I work at uses artificial intelligence to build software that helps companies protect well-being of their employees in the workplace. It helps prevent burnout and stuff like that. So my project consists of a few parts. I start by looking at the effects of COVID-19 on mental health in the United States, as well as what are some long-lasting effects that can be expected years after it will be gone one day. I then look at the traditional established techniques for treating stress, anxiety, and depression disorders. Obviously, there are two venues for treatment, which is drug-based and psychotherapy or talk therapy, and I focus on psychotherapy exclusively. And I also narrow down my focus to cognitive behavioral therapy as a psychotherapy technique because it's one of the most popular and widespread psychotherapy technique for treating conditions I look at. And also in past research, it was shown that CBT can be successfully delivered in a remote format without losing its effectiveness. And as I'm looking at some telehealth solutions, a technique that works effectively in remote format is an important factor to consider. After learning more about the troubled state of mental health care and some limitations in the current treatment, I look at a few AI-driven telehealth solutions, and by looking at them, I try to assess the feasibility of artificial intelligence in alleviating the mental health crisis. And I conclude my paper by looking at medical community attitudes towards such applications in mental health care. And due to the time constraint, obviously, I won't be able to cover everything. But what I want to talk about is show you a few examples of AI-driven telehealth solutions and a little introduction. So the introduction is, why are we talking about artificial intelligence and mental health together, and why artificial intelligence has a place in mental health? The way I address this question is by looking at the mental health statistics and the state of mental health care. And just to reiterate some statistics that were already mentioned by some of the presenters, like it's not news that pandemic had a detrimental effect on mental health. It doubled the rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicide thoughts. The number of people suffering from anxiety and depression in the United States increased by 11.6 million. And in addition to the increased rates, there is a huge accessibility problem happening. 56% of adults and more than 60% of youth receive no care that they need. And among the reasons for that are problems like workforce shortages, uneven coverage, cost of care, and stigma. The demand for services was high even before the pandemic, and this demand was not met even back then. And the pandemic just increased the demand further. Like there is simply not enough professionals to meet this demand, and the coverage is also very disproportionate and uneven between states and cities. For example, more than 60% of US counties have no practicing psychiatrists. In addition to the accessibility problem, another big issue is the ineffectiveness of psychotherapy treatment. And in mental health care, one condition can vary greatly between patients, and what works for one patient might have no effect on another. So treatment most of the time takes a form of trial and error. And usually a patient who seeks therapy has a 50% chance of recovery. And doctors have a really hard time personalizing the treatment and finding a technique that would work for a patient. And patients get overwhelmed and desperate that they will ever feel better. So now all these statistics and facts tell us that something needs to be done to provide affordable, effective mental health care for everyone. And as the current state is troubled, and the traditional treatment techniques have certain limitations, we need to seek alternative solutions. Obviously, there might be different approaches, but in my paper, I look at artificial intelligence as one of such interventions. So as I just mentioned, all the statistics, I think we can identify the two most prominent problems, which is accessibility and the ineffectiveness of care. And in my project, I also identified two roles that artificial intelligence can play to target these two problems respectively. The first role of AI is acting as a therapist, trying to replace human therapists, where it will target the problem of accessibility. And the second role of AI would be acting as a supplement to a human therapist, where it will target the problem of ineffectiveness of treatment. Now moving to some examples. The first problem at hand is accessibility, and the role of AI here is acting as a therapist. The most common form of applications where artificial intelligence can act as a therapist on its own is in chatbot apps. And in my paper, I looked at two chatbots available called Tess and Woobat. Both chatbots act as conversational agents that can deliver psychotherapy and psychoeducation, and they are also following cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. And the way users interact with these chatbots is by simply texting the chatbot and receiving responses, either in a mobile app or using regular text service. There were two randomized controlled trials conducted to study the effectiveness of these chatbots, and they showed really positive results. For example, TESS reduced symptoms of depression by 28% and anxiety by 18%. and Rubat reduced symptoms of depression by 21% and anxiety by 23%. And in addition to successfully reducing the anxiety and depression symptoms, these chatbots also showed another benefit, which is they showed themselves as effective learning platforms. Study participants shared that they learned a lot of useful information, and they have an understanding of what small steps they can take every day to make themselves feel better. And this is an important finding because in cognitive behavioral therapy that is delivered even in person by a human therapist, patients are taught to be their own therapist in a way, to understand the distortions in their thinking and to control their thoughts. And chatbots have the ability to teach users a variety of such useful techniques and understand their conditions better. And it can already help a lot of people and make them feel better if they cannot access care otherwise. Also, another benefit of these chatbots was that they helped users build consistency. And it's another crucial part of psychotherapy and I think everything that we do. And the reason is what it was possible is due to the overall engaging nature of the app and features like mood tracking, journaling, and others. And also, these two studies and past research showed that chatbots can be effective at fighting the big problem of stigma. And stigma is a known factor that prevents huge numbers of people from seeking care. And even once they seek care, they often feel hesitant to open up to a human therapist and talk about certain personal problems. And chatbots have the ability to overcome that because of the feeling that chatbot therapy creates. Patients don't feel that a computer or a machine has the capability to judge them for whatever they say. And one might argue that there is a negative side to it, and the feeling of talking to a machine at the same time will never give the same empathy and compassion as a human therapist can provide. But based on these two studies, it was not true, and empathy was actually named one of the best parts of both chatbots by study participants. Now, next examples, next problem is the ineffectiveness of care, of treatment, and the role of artificial intelligence here is acting as a supplement to human therapists. In my project, I looked at two examples of services offered by ISO Digital Health and Listen, and both companies developed their custom AI-driven technologies that can record and transcribe therapy sessions given by a human therapist. And their algorithms further categorize the session into therapist tutorance categories. And this categorization provides insights into session content. It shows which parts were effective, how much time was spent on constructive therapy, and how much time was spent on general chit-chat. And a therapist can access these platforms in an easy visual format on the platforms that the screenshots of which you can see on the screen. And by looking at this, therapists can analyze and reflect on their own performance. Also, patients are asked to complete questionnaires at the end of each session, which asks about the frequency of their symptoms. And these questionnaires, along with these platforms, allows therapists to correlate patients' improvements with the specific techniques they used in the session. And at the end, therapists can personalize the care for each specific patient and ensure it's effective. Also, these platforms can act as clinical decision support tools. Therapists can set an agenda or a session plan for themselves, and the platforms will tell them whether they met their goal or not for the session. And to conclude with some statistics, ISO Digital Health, which are mental health providers themselves, were able to improve their recovery rates from 52 to 62% over the past 4 years with the help of this technology. And also they deliver psychotherapy in completely remote format, which shows that psychotherapy indeed can be delivered successfully remotely. And what's more interesting, they also delivered it in the form of texting.
Time is up, so if we can have some concluding thoughts, and then we can have a
Yeah,
couple
I was
minutes.
actually at my last sentence. Yeah, I was just saying that they delivered their services in completely remote format, and it also was in the form of texting other than talking, so it shows some potential for chatbots as well. Yeah, that was it.
All right, thank you for everyone. We're finished. Okay, all right. So it looks like time is up, and I don't think we'll have any time for questions. So thank you for everybody who showed up today, and thank you for all the speakers. Great work, guys.
Great job, Anastasia.
Thank you.